The wind picked up as the first snowstorm of the season swept across Wyoming's high plains. Hank O'Reilly stood at the window of his small cabin, watching the swirling snow bury the world outside. He was no stranger to these storms. 38 years on the frontier had taught him that when the snow came early, it came hard. The howling wind was a constant reminder that survival here was a matter of preparation, not luck. Hank wasn't like the others. The settlers in the nearby town were panicking, scrambling to gather whatever food and supplies they could. Salt, that precious commodity for preserving meat, was in short supply. The trains bringing it from town were stalled, buried in the snow. The settlers didn't have the time to wait, and most wouldn't survive the harsh months without it. But Hank wasn't worried. He had learned long ago that the land provided everything you needed. You just had to know how to take it. With a slow, deliberate movement, Hank turned away from the window and stepped into the small room where his preparations had already begun. Venison, freshly butchered from the deer he'd shot days earlier, hung from the rafters. His hands were already rough with work, the calluses from years of labor worn deep into his palms. The meat had been cut, but it needed preserving for the winter ahead. Salt would have been the easy choice, but there was no salt this year. Instead, Hank had his method. It was one passed down from the old mountain men, a trick that used smoke to preserve meat without salt. He had learned it from Buck Johnson, an old trapper who had taught him how to survive in this unforgiving land. The technique wasn't quick, but it was reliable. Hank adjusted the fire in the hearth, ensuring that the smoke would rise and seep deep into the meat hanging from the ceiling. Slowly, carefully, he worked to perfect the smoke. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the snow began to fall thicker. But inside Hank's cabin, there was only warmth and the steady rhythm of his work. By the time the snowstorm reached its peak, Hank was finished. The meat was preserved, sealed by the smoke, ready for the long winter ahead. He stepped back from his work, his hands smelling of wood and venison, and looked out the window again. The storm was relentless, but Hank was ready. This winter would be harsh, but it would not break him. Not this time, not ever again. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's rough wooden walls. Inside, Hank O'Reilly adjusted the meat hanging from the rafters, checking it for the perfect amount of smoke. He knew that once the meat was sealed in the smoke, it would keep for the entire winter if done right. The process was slow, deliberate, but Hank had no patience for shortcuts. He had learned the hard way that, on the frontier, survival demanded you take your time. It hadn't always been this way, though. Hank remembered the first time. He'd learned this method back when he was just a boy. The winter of his 16th year had been one of the coldest on record, the kind of winter that could break even the strongest man. He'd gone out trapping with Buck Johnson, an old mountain man who had made the frontier his life. It was Buck who had first shown him the power of smoke. "I don't use salt, boy," Buck had said, his voice gravelly, eyes narrowing as he checked the fire. "You don't need it when you know how to use fire and smoke. Salt's for city folk." Hank had been skeptical. He'd watched as Buck hung pieces of venison over a slow-burning fire, the smoke swirling around the meat, coating it gently but thoroughly. Hank had been used to the method of salting, rubbing the meat down, waiting days for it to cure. But this was different. This was something he had never seen before. "You see, the trick's not in burning it. It's in the smoke," Buck had explained. "Let it hang, and let it soak in. Smoke's a preservative all its own, keeps the rot away, seals the meat from the inside out. It's the way the mountain men did it." That first winter with Buck, Hank had learned that there was no need to rush things. The fire had to be just right, low and steady. Too much heat, and the meat would scorch. Too little, and the smoke wouldn't do its job. The fire had to breathe with the air, steady but unhurried. It wasn't just the heat, it was the time, the patience, and the knowledge of what needed to be done. Now, as Hank hung the venison in his cabin, he reflected on that winter. He was no longer the boy eager to prove himself. No, Hank had learned that survival wasn't about speed, it was about being prepared. The meat was now bathed in smoke, and Hank knew it would stay preserved for as long as he needed it. This method, learned from Buck and perfected over years, was what had kept him alive through many a harsh winter. The snowstorm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Hank was calm, secure in the knowledge that he had what he needed to survive. The storm would pass, but the meat, thanks to the smoke, would last. The snowstorm howled relentlessly through the night, its fury echoing against the walls of Hank O'Reilly's cabin. The wind seemed to tear at the very foundation of the earth itself, howling in waves like a living thing, intent on erasing all that stood in its path. Hank sat in front of the hearth, his face lit by the warm, flickering glow of the fire, watching the way the flames danced. Outside, the world had gone silent beneath the weight of the snow. His cabin, nestled in the Wyoming hills, was one of the few refuges left standing in the wilderness. The storm had been building for days. It came early this year, too early for comfort. Hank had prepared, of course. He had learned long ago that when the land turned against you, you couldn't rely on luck. You had to depend on yourself. The venison was now preserved by the NXS-handed smoke, hanging from the rafters, ready to sustain him through the cold months ahead. The fire crackled steadily, sending waves of warmth into the cabin, pushing back against the chill that crept through every crack. But even with all his preparations, Hank knew that survival wasn't a guarantee. No amount of smoke, no careful planning could stop the unforgiving bite of a winter storm. He'd seen enough death in his time on the frontier to know that. There was always something unpredictable. One wrong step, one missed opportunity. It could all be gone in an instant. He leaned back in his chair and stretched his legs toward the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the rough-hewn walls. His thoughts drifted back to past winters, long, bitter seasons, where he had learned the value of patience, of listening to the land. In his early years, Hank had been reckless, eager to prove himself, thinking that survival was about toughness alone. He had learned, over time, that toughness wasn't enough. You had to be clever, you had to be patient, and you had to trust the lessons of those who had come before. The old-timers had told him about winters like this one. They had spoken in hushed tones, warning about the cruelty of early storms and the desperation of isolation. The first time Hank had faced one of these storms alone, the wind had whipped through his bones, the snow had buried his door, and he had feared for his life. But now, years later, he was no longer afraid. He had learned to listen to the storm, to understand it, and to use it to his advantage. He rose from his chair, the creaking of the floorboards breaking the stillness. He checked the meat again, ensuring the smoke had done its work. The venison was darkened now, a deep brown, and the smell of it hung in the air, rich and earthy. This was Hank's food for the winter, no salt, no store-bought provisions. Just his own skill, honed through years of living on the land. As the storm raged outside, Hank thought about how different life had been when he first arrived in these parts. There had been no one to teach him the ways of survival, no one to show him the tricks. He had been forced to learn everything the hard way, and while the isolation of the frontier could feel crushing at times, Hank had come to appreciate the lessons it offered. The storm outside was relentless, but inside his cabin, Hank felt a quiet satisfaction. He was ready. The wind didn't stop. It just howled, pushing the snow across the plains like an army marching with no end in sight. Hank O'Reilly stared out the cabin window, watching the storm bury the world. What had started as a light dusting a few days ago had turned into a full-on blizzard. The snow came down in thick sheets, veiling the landscape in white. His mind lingered on the same question that had plagued him ever since the storm hit. Would the meat hold? The venison had been hung in the cabin, carefully smoked, each piece bathed in the fire's warmth. But Hank knew that even the best method of preservation wasn't infallible. There were always variables, things you couldn't account for, like the bitter cold that seeped through the smallest cracks or the possibility of the fire dying in the middle of the night. It only took one misstep to spoil what could otherwise last months. Hank stood up, stretching his stiff legs. The cabin felt small, even though it had been built to withstand winters like this. He moved to the hearth, his boots crunching on the wooden floor, and checked the fire again. The coals were still hot, glowing deep red, but the wind howled so loudly outside that Hank couldn't tell if it was the storm or his own instincts making him uneasy. There was no telling how long this blizzard would last, and Hank didn't trust the weather to play by anyone's rules. The fire had to stay steady, or everything he'd done, the careful preparation, the meticulous hours spent over the smoke would have been for nothing. As he adjusted the logs on the fire, something shifted. The flames sputtered for a second, then returned to their familiar, crackling rhythm. But for a brief moment, Hank felt something unsettling in the air, a cold draft. He turned quickly, walking to the door. It was shut tight. The cold wasn't coming from the door. It was the chimney. He hadn't noticed it before, but now he realized the fire was not burning quite as strong as it should have. Hank reached the hearth, crouched down, and checked the chimney. The draft wasn't right. His pulse quickened. If the chimney was blocked, if the smoke couldn't escape, the meat wouldn't stay preserved. The smell of burning wood and the faint, tangy scent of venison were already thick in the air. If the smoke backed up inside, it would ruin everything. Without the proper ventilation, the meat would spoil in hours, not weeks. A harsh gust of wind rattled the cabin walls. Hank's heart raced as he grabbed his coat and stepped outside into the storm. He could barely see in front of him, the snow so thick that it was as if the world had disappeared. He pushed forward, each step a battle against the wind, determined to reach the chimney and clear the blockage before it was too late. The snow was thickening rapidly, the cold biting at his skin. Hank's hands shook as he worked to clear the chimney. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, each second counting as the storm pressed in around him. When the last of the snow was removed, Hank stood there for a moment, catching his breath. The cold, the darkness, the storm, they all seemed less important now. What mattered was that he had done it. He turned back toward the cabin, his thoughts already on the venison and the long, cold months ahead. The storm raged on through the night, its fury making Hank O'Reilly's small cabin feel more like a ship in the middle of a violent sea. The wind howled, its constant roar making the walls tremble and the fire flicker as it fought against the cold. Hank sat by the hearth, warming his hands over the flame, his gaze drifting between the fire and the cabin door, which rattled with each gust of wind. The snow was piling up outside, thick and fast, and Hank had begun to wonder how long the storm would last. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. It came unexpectedly, startling Hank out of his thoughts. A knock? Out here? No one came to visit in storms like this, at least not unless they had no other choice. Hank's hand moved instinctively to the rifle by the door. He had been alone for so long that the idea of someone else out there, knocking at his door, set his senses on edge. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice strained, almost drowned out by the wind. "Please, help. I'm lost." Hank's heart raced, the instincts of a man who had lived alone for too long kicking in. He slowly moved to the door, checking the latch to ensure it was secure. He opened it just enough to see a figure standing in the snow. A man, his coat covered in snow, his face pale and drawn from the cold. The man was hunched, his shoulders shaking. He looked like he had been out there for hours. "Please," the man pleaded, his breath visible in the cold air. "I need shelter. I can't make it back. My camp's a few miles south, but I lost the trail." Hank eyed the stranger. He didn't trust anyone who wandered out here in the storm, but something about the man's eyes told him he wasn't lying. He was desperate. And desperate people didn't lie, they survived. "You can come in," Hank said, his voice low and cautious. "But you'll need to prove you're not bringing any trouble." The man nodded gratefully and stepped inside, the cold air spilling in after him. Hank closed the door quickly, locking out the storm. The warmth of the fire hit the man like a wave, and he staggered toward it, collapsing to his knees, hands held out to the flames. "Name's Luke," the man said between chattering teeth. "Thank you." Hank didn't speak for a moment. He had been alone for so long that words felt unnecessary. He studied the stranger quietly, noting the way Luke's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. He was on the edge of collapse. "Sit by the fire," Hank said, his tone more of an order than an offer. "Get warm. You're lucky to have found me. Storm's not letting up any time soon." Luke nodded, his teeth still chattering. Hank, watching the man settle by the fire, felt a strange sense of unease settle in his chest. The storm outside wasn't the only thing threatening survival tonight. There was something about this man, something Hank couldn't place. But he wasn't about to send him back into the cold. "Don't know how long this storm will last," Hank said, the silence heavy between them. "Could be days before we see clear skies." Luke nodded again, his eyes cast down, avoiding Hank's gaze. The Cleese, quiet, stretched on, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Hank stared into the flames, wondering how long it would take before Luke's story would reveal itself. The fire in Hank O'Reilly's cabin crackled with a comforting warmth, but the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. The snow had piled up so thick that it nearly obscured the door, and the wind howled, shaking the very walls of the small structure. Inside, Hank and Luke sat in front of the hearth, the warmth of the fire the only shield against the bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep through the cracks of the cabin. Luke had quieted down after his initial shock of being welcomed into the warmth. Now he sat by the fire, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. Hank studied him with quiet suspicion, wondering what kind of man would be caught so helpless in a storm like this. It was rare to find someone in this part of Wyoming during the winter. Most people who stayed out here were the type to survive on their own, to endure the harshness of the land without complaint. But Luke didn't seem like the type to make it on his own. His clothes were ragged, soaked through, and his hands were shaking, despite the warmth of the fire. "You've been out there too long," Hank said after a while, his voice low. "What's your story?" Luke glanced at Hank, his eyes filled with both gratitude and caution. "I've been trapping up near the Yellowstone River," he said slowly, as if weighing every word. "Got caught in the storm, lost my bearings, thought I could find shelter, but I was wrong." Hank nodded, understanding the mistake. The wilderness could play tricks on the mind, especially when the storm hit like this. The wind howled outside, making it difficult to hear anything over the roar. Hank knew all too well how quickly the land could turn from friend to foe. "You're lucky you found me," Hank said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger. "Most folks who get caught out here don't make it. Could have frozen to death out there." Luke nodded again, his gaze cast down to the fire. Hank didn't trust him entirely, but there was something in the way Luke had stumbled into his cabin, something about his quiet desperation that made Hank feel an odd kinship. They were both just trying to survive the same brutal winter. The two men sat in silence, the wind outside rattling the walls. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows on the rough-hewn logs of the cabin. Hank kept his eyes on the flames, letting the warmth seep into his bones. It had been a long time since he'd shared his cabin with anyone, and even longer since he'd shared a fire. The storm raged through the night, and Hank knew they had no choice but to wait it out. The snow would bury the land even deeper, and they'd be stuck here until it cleared. It was going to be a cold, long night. But Hank wasn't worried. He had the fire, and he had the food. He'd been alone before, and he'd make it through again. The storm did not let up. Days passed in a blur of howling winds, heavy snow, and freezing cold. Hank O'Reilly and Luke stayed holed up in the small cabin, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside rattling the walls like a persistent enemy. Luke had taken to helping Hank with little tasks around the cabin, chopping firewood, stoking the fire, and keeping the venison hung from the rafters properly smoked. But Hank couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't just a test of their survival, it was a test of trust. Luke was a stranger, after all. Hank hadn't known him a day, yet here he was, sharing his food and warmth, all because the storm had driven him to Hank's doorstep. They'd shared stories over the fire, but neither man had ventured much into personal details. Hank was a man who didn't share much, and something about Luke made him wary. There was something he wasn't saying. Hank could feel it. But for now, they were bound together by the storm. The days dragged on in a kind of tense stasis. Hank spent his time preparing for the future, the months ahead, when the land would be buried under snow and the isolation would stretch even longer. He focused on the venison, the fire, and the things that could keep them alive until the thaw came. The storm began to lose its bite after nearly a week, but the snow continued to fall in thick, steady sheets. It was the kind of snow that buried tracks and silenced the world, leaving the earth bare and untouched. Hank knew this was the quiet before the real challenge arrived. The hardest part of winter wasn't the snow or the cold, it was the isolation. After the storms, after the snow, it was just you and the land, and you had to be ready for it. One morning, as Hank stepped outside to check the woodpile, he noticed something subtle but significant. The air was different. There was a stillness to it, a calmness that wasn't there before. He could smell the earth beneath the snow, feel the change in the way the wind blew. The storm had broken, and the land was shifting. Hank moved back inside, the weight of the change heavy on his shoulders. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the storm finally ended and the land began to speak again. It meant that they had survived, but it also meant that life would soon return to the land and the trials of the frontier would resume. Luke was sitting by the fire, his eyes trained on the flames. Hank stood still for a moment, watching him, unsure of what to say. The storm had ended, but what would happen next? "We'll need to leave soon," Hank said quietly. Luke looked up, nodding slowly. "Where to?" he asked. "Doesn't matter," Hank replied, his voice steady. "We just keep going." The days grew longer, and the snow began to slow its descent. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of white that covered the land, hiding all traces of the life that had struggled to survive beneath it. Hank O'Reilly stood outside his cabin, watching the way the sun reflected off the snow, casting long, cold shadows across the prairie. The world was quiet now, almost too quiet. The wind no longer howled, but the silence was heavy, like the land was holding its breath. Hank's gaze shifted toward the smoke rising from the chimney. It was the only thing that gave him comfort. He had built this cabin with his own hands, one piece at a time, carving out a place of refuge from the harshness of the world. He had prepared for this moment for years, learning the ways of the land, the tricks to survive the unforgiving winters. The smoke trick had been his lifeline, the one thing he could rely on when all else seemed uncertain. He looked down at the firewood stacked neatly beside the cabin, ready to be chopped and burned through the coming weeks. It was the same routine that had kept him alive year after year, the simple acts of survival that gave him purpose. But as he worked, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Luke was still here, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Hank hadn't expected him to stay, but the man had proven himself over the days spent in the cabin. He had helped with the work, learned quickly, and, more importantly, respected the land as Hank did. Still, there was something unsettling about the quiet between them, an unspoken tension that lingered in the room like the smoke curling from the fire. "You've been quiet," Hank said, his voice breaking the silence as he turned toward Luke. Luke shifted his gaze from the fire to Hank. "Just thinking," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "About how much of what you've taught me could help others." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Others?" Luke nodded slowly. "The way you preserve meat with smoke, it's more than just survival. It's a way of life, a way to keep the past alive." Hank hadn't thought about it that way. To him, it was just what had worked, just what kept him alive. But Luke's words struck a chord deep within him. The legacy of the smoke wasn't just about food. It was about the knowledge passed down from men who had faced the same hardships, who had learned the same lessons from the land. Hank's father had taught him how to hunt, how to trap, how to survive in the wild. But it wasn't just about surviving, it was about understanding the land and living with it, not against it. "Maybe you're right," Hank said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "But I'm no teacher, just a man who's figured out how to make it another winter." Luke looked at him with a quiet understanding. Sometimes what we figure out can save someone else's life. Hank's gaze softened. He looked out at the snow-covered hills and felt a deep, quiet pride in the life he had built. It was simple, but it was his, and it had kept him alive. The Fire crackled behind him, the smoke rising like a promise into the cold morning air. Maybe it was time to share the secret, to pass the knowledge along, not just to survive, but to live. The storm had passed, but the world outside still looked like a frozen wasteland. The snow had piled high, blanketing everything in white. Hank O'Reilly stood at the window of his cabin, staring out at the endless expanse of snow. The wind had stopped, but the cold still pressed in, a constant reminder of how unforgiving the land could be. Hank had lived through many winters on this frontier, but something about this one felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The wind outside had stopped, but the cold had seeped into everything. Luke sat across from Hank, staring into the fire. His face was gaunt from days spent battling the storm, his eyes sunken from exhaustion. Hank had come to respect the man's resilience, but he also sensed something deeper in Luke. There was a quiet restlessness about him, a tension Hank couldn't quite place. "You're quiet tonight," Hank said, his voice breaking the stillness. Luke shifted, his gaze flickering toward Hank. "Just thinking," he said quietly. "Thinking about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Hank asked, his brow furrowing. Luke leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "This storm. It's been rough. But once it clears, then what? We're still stuck out here. How do we keep going when the world's shut down like this?" Hank considered the question. It was one that he had asked himself 1,000 times during his years on the frontier. The storms, the cold, it was all part of the fight to survive. But there was something else that made this time different. Something that Luke had touched on. "We keep going the way we always have," Hank said, his voice steady. "We survive. The storm ends, and we do what we have to do." Luke didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted back to the fire, watching the orange flames dance. "But it's not just about surviving, is it? There's more to it than that. Survival means knowing the land, knowing how to work with it, not just holding on, but learning how to live alongside it." Hank took a deep breath. He had lived through enough winters to know what Luke meant. Survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about understanding the land, the seasons, and the rhythms of nature. It was about knowing that the wilderness was not something to be fought, it was something to be respected. "You're right," Hank said slowly. "Survival isn't about fighting the land, it's about living with it. You learn to listen to the land, and it'll teach you how to survive." Luke nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "I never saw it that way," he admitted. "I always thought it was about holding on, but now I see it's more about understanding." Hank glanced at the fire, feeling a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, but the true test was still ahead. Not just of survival, but of knowing the land and the wisdom it held. He looked at Luke. "You'll get it. Just keep listening." Outside, the storm may have ended, but inside, Hank felt something shifting. It wasn't just the change of seasons, it was something deeper, something that came from truly understanding the land. The morning after the storm was eerily quiet. The wind had stopped, and the snow lay in thick drifts, blanketing the land in a silent stillness. Hank O'Reilly stepped outside the cabin, boots crunching on the frozen ground, and looked out over the vast expanse. The world seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a white wilderness that was both beautiful and brutal. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and then exhaled slowly. There was something about the aftermath of a storm that felt like a fresh start, a chance to move forward, to rebuild, to continue surviving. Luke stood beside him, staring out over the snow-covered plains. His eyes, though tired, carried a quiet determination that Hank had come to respect. The man had been through the worst of the storm, and now he stood with Hank, both of them facing the same challenge. What came next? "It's still out there," Luke said quietly, his voice low against the stillness of the morning. "The land, we've got what we need now. But what happens when we run out? What happens when the next storm comes?" Hank considered the question, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The land doesn't give you what you need all at once. You have to take it piece by piece, day by day. If you've prepared right, if you've listened to the land, you'll know when to move, when to stay. Luke nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. Hank could see the wheels turning in the younger man's mind, the same uncertainty that had gnawed at him during his own early years. Survival wasn't just about physical strength, it was about knowing when to act and when to be patient. It was about trusting your instincts and letting the land guide you. "We could leave," Hank said finally, breaking the silence. "The storm's over. We could head west, find a new place." But it's not just about where you go. It's about knowing how to make the land work for you. Luke looked over at him, uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. "And you think I'm ready for that?" Hank smiled slightly, the creases in his face softening. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't." The words hung in the air between them. Hank had known from the moment Luke arrived at his doorstep that the storm had brought more than just a stranger, it had brought a new challenge, one that Hank wasn't sure he was ready for. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the world spread out before them, he felt a quiet assurance that the lessons of survival, passed down from the old-timers, would continue. They weren't just about enduring the storms, they were about understanding the land, trusting it to teach you what you needed to know. The horizon was wide and empty, but Hank felt a strange sense of peace in that emptiness. The future, like the land, was uncertain, but with the fire of the land inside him, he knew they could make it. "Let's go," Hank said, turning back toward the cabin. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Hank was ready.